The ground is shaking. Thousands of heavily armoured French knights are charging down the slope, straight at you at a deadly speed. Behind you lies an impassable forest. There is nowhere to run. Your men are exhausted and your arrows are running dangerously low. To make matters worse, the enemy outnumbers you 6-1. In the 14th century, this is the ultimate recipe for a massacre. Yet the English commander, William de Bohun, isn't afraid. He simply smiles. He fixes his eyes on the slope where the knights are galloping toward them and gives his men a single order. Just wait, because there is something the French don't know. Bohun and his men spent the entire previous night digging into that very slope, building an invisible hell that would change the course of history. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we are covering the Battle of Morlaix, the engagement that invented the template England used to defeat France again and again and again. But before we get to that hillside and those hidden pits, we need to understand what the English army was doing in Brittany at all, and why a succession dispute in a French duchy was about to produce one of the most consequential tactical innovations in medieval history. Brittany in 1341 was a prize. The duchy sat on the Atlantic coast of France, its ports controlling access to the Channel, its harbours essential to any power seeking to project force into the western Mediterranean or the Bay of Biscay. When the Duke of Brittany died without a clear male heir, two claimants stepped forward. On one side, Jean de Montfort, the Duke's half-brother, who had immediately seized the treasury and most of the fortified towns. On the other, Charles de Blois, who had married the Duke's niece and had the backing of the King of France. For the English king, Edward III, this was an opportunity that appeared at exactly the right moment. He had been claiming the throne of France since 1337, had fought the opening campaigns of what would become the 100 Years' War, and needed a foothold on the French coast. Supporting Jean de Montfort gave him exactly that. The French, supporting Charles de Blois, had both dynastic logic and overwhelming local support on their side. The early years of the Breton succession war went badly for the Montfortist cause. Jean de Montfort was captured and imprisoned in Paris. The resistance continued under his wife, Jeanne de Montfort, a woman of formidable capability who held the western ports and appealed urgently to England for help. In August 1342, William de Bohun arrived with a fleet and an army. The relief of Brest, where Jeanne had been holding out, was achieved with characteristic English efficiency. The Genoese mercenary galleys blockading the port from the sea were scattered when the English fleet appeared. 11 of their ships taken or destroyed. Charles de Blois, watching from shore and overestimating the size of the force that had landed, lifted his siege and withdrew eastward to Guingamp. The balance of the campaign had shifted. Bohun moved inland. In early September he reached Morlaix, a fortified coastal town on the northern Breton coast, strategically valuable, accessible to English supply by sea. He attacked it directly on the first day and was repulsed with serious losses. He settled in for a siege. Charles de Blois had been assembling his forces at Guingamp. By late September he had somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 men. The medieval chroniclers, as they habitually did, inflated the numbers dramatically to make the subsequent English victory more impressive, but modern historians have revised the figures substantially downward. What is not in dispute is the ratio. The French significantly outnumbered Bohun's force of approximately 2,000, and Charles had the additional advantage of a large and well-equipped cavalry component. He now marched west to relieve Morlaix and destroy the English besieging force. Bohun could not ignore this and maintain the siege. He could not fight Charles de Blois with Morlaix's garrison at his back. He had to choose ground and fight. What he chose and how he chose it is the lesson that Morlaix teaches. Bohun left a small force watching the city and marched east along the Lanmeur road with his main army to meet the French advance. He was looking for a specific kind of position, not the flat ground that favoured cavalry, but something he had seen work before. He had been at Halidon Hill in 1333, when Edward III had destroyed a Scottish army by placing dismounted knights in the centre, longbowmen on the flanks, and letting the Scots come uphill to their destruction. He understood the geometry of that kind of battle better than almost anyone alive in 1342. He had also fought at Sluys in 1340, commanding part of the English fleet in the naval action that had given England control of the Channel for the opening decades of the war. He was not a man who relied on improvisation. He was a man who studied what worked and applied it. He needed a slope, a tree line to anchor his rear, and time before the French arrived. He found all three on a ridge outside Lanmeur. The position was clean. The forest behind him meant Charles de Blois could not encircle him. The ground fell away ahead toward the road along which the French would approach, meaning that any cavalry charge would come uphill. He ordered his knights to dismount and form the centre of the line. He placed his longbowmen in echelon on both flanks, projecting slightly forward so that their arrows could cross the front of the infantry position from both sides simultaneously. Then he put his men to work. Through the night, English soldiers dug, not the kind of digging that produces earthworks and palisades, that would have been visible to approaching cavalry. What they dug were narrow, deep pits, scattered across the slope in front of the English position, and covered with branches and dried grass and soil. The covering was done carefully, in the dark so that the surface looked undisturbed. From a distance, the ground in front of the English line appeared to be ordinary meadow grass. It was not. The traps were designed for horses. A destrier in full charge, carrying a knight in plate armour, weighs somewhere between half a ton and 3/4 of a ton, moving at 25 miles an hour. Drop the front legs of that animal into a pit 18 inches wide and 3 feet deep, and the physics are brutal and immediate. The horse goes down, the momentum carries the rider over the animal's head, and the knights behind, coming at the same speed and unable to stop, compound the disaster. This is the mechanism that Bohun was relying on, not the longbow, though the longbow would be essential. The pits would break the charge before it reached the English line. The arrows would break the momentum as the charge began. The dismounted knights would hold whatever came through both. The French arrived in the early afternoon. Charles de Blois had organised his army in the traditional French manner. 3 waves, each one large enough to overwhelm the English separately if the previous wave had worn them down. The first wave was infantry and militia, the kind of force that existed in every medieval army as a buffer, absorbing the enemy's attention, and fire while the real fighting strength of mounted knights prepared behind them. The English longbowmen opened fire when the first wave came into range. The range of an English longbow was considerable, a maximum of 250 yards or more for a high-arching volley shot. But the effective range at which arrows could penetrate armour and cause serious harm was considerably shorter, somewhere between 100 and 150 yards, where the bodkin-tipped shafts retained enough energy to drive through mail and plate at the joints. The French infantry approaching across open ground entered the outer range of the volley fire well before they came within that effective inner band, which meant the English archers had time to put multiple arrows into the air, 10 to 12 per minute per man. Before the enemy closed to dangerous distance, the effect was severe and rapid. The French infantry broke and retreated before reaching the English line, leaving the slope in front of Bohun's position covered with casualties and abandoned equipment. Charles de Blois now committed his knights. The second wave was the flower of the French and Breton aristocracy, led by Geoffroy de Charny, a man so widely recognised as the embodiment of knightly virtue that he would later write the definitive medieval treatise on chivalry, arguing that the man who actually fights is worth more than the man who merely talks about fighting, and that the highest honour belongs not to those born to it, but to those who earn it through conduct in the field. He was a first-rate soldier and a first-rate man, and he was about to learn something that his chivalric philosophy had not prepared him for. He would eventually die at Poitiers in 1356, carrying the sacred royal banner of France rather than flee the field, standing his ground to the end in a manner entirely consistent with everything he had written and believed. But that was 14 years away. At Morlaix he was 35 years old and leading the finest cavalry charge he could assemble. If any mounted force in Europe could break an English position through sheer quality and determination, it was this one. They came uphill at the gallop, took arrows throughout the approach, and rode into the hidden pits. The front rank of the charge went down in seconds. Horses that had been at full stretch suddenly had no ground under their forelegs. They fell, some of them breaking their own necks, most tumbling and throwing their riders forward onto the slope. The horses behind them, still coming at speed, had nowhere to go. The charge that had been a single coordinated mass became a confusion of fallen animals and dismounted men struggling in heavy armour on a slope covered in the bodies of their own horses. Into this the English came. Bohun's dismounted knights advanced into the tangle. The longbowmen kept firing from the flanks, picking off the mounted men who had not yet reached the pits. In the close fighting, the English used the weapon of the infantry against fallen cavalry. The hammer, the short blade, the point of a knife into a visor slot. Geoffroy de Charny was taken prisoner by Richard Talbot. Approximately 150 French knights were captured. More were killed in the collapse of the charge. Charles de Blois' second wave had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The third wave did not hold back. Charles de Blois committed his remaining force, still larger than the battered English army, and pushed forward. But Bohun had already made his calculation. His arrows were exhausted. His men had been fighting for hours, and the slope in front of their position was now levelled by fallen horses and men. The pits that had broken the charge were filled. The obstacle was gone. Against a fresh assault by cavalry and infantry with no arrow cover and no prepared ground, holding the open hillside was no longer viable. Bohun gave the order to withdraw into the forest. This was not a defeat. It was a calculated movement, under pressure. The kind of thing that distinguishes a professional army from a feudal levy. The English withdrew in formation, facing the enemy, moving step by step into the tree line behind them. In the forest, they formed a defensive circle with their spears outward. The French cavalry could not follow into the trees. Charles de Blois settled for a siege, hoping to starve them out. He failed at that too. Several days later, in darkness, Bohun's force broke out through the French encirclement and returned to Morlaix. They brought with them their prisoners, including Geoffroy de Charny, who would eventually pay his ransom and return to France as formidably honourable as he had left it. Charles de Blois, his Genoese mercenaries having deserted after the battle, his main cavalry force shattered, and his relief operation a complete failure, withdrew his army and left Morlaix to its siege. The siege continued, the city fell, and the lesson of the engagement outside Lanmeur began to spread through the English command, tested now against real cavalry, and proved. 4 years later at Crécy, Edward III would use the same system at a larger scale. Dismounted knights at the centre, longbowmen on the flanks, cavalry charging uphill into prepared positions. The French would send wave after wave and lose them all. At Poitiers in 1356, the Black Prince would win a defensive victory against odds similar to Bohun's at Morlaix, capturing the King of France himself. At Agincourt in 1415, Henry V would add the innovation of stakes driven into the ground in front of the longbowmen, the natural evolution of Bohun's hidden pits. And the result would be the same. What Bohun had done at Morlaix was prove that the system worked. Not in theory, not in a lucky victory against a confused enemy, but in a real engagement against a large, well-led French force that included the finest knights in Brittany. The dismounted men-at-arms had held the line. The longbowmen had broken the momentum of the charge before it reached them. The hidden ground obstacles had destroyed the charge at the critical moment. And when circumstances demanded it, the army had been disciplined enough to execute a controlled withdrawal without collapsing. That combination, the archers, the dismounted knights, the prepared ground, would define English warfare for the next 80 years. Every time France sent cavalry against a prepared English position and lost, the chain led back to the hillside outside Lanmeur, where William de Bohun had watched his pits fill with horses and had ordered his men to hold the line. He died in 1360. He had lived to see Crécy. He never saw Agincourt. But Agincourt was there in the choice he made on that September night in 1342, when he set his men to digging in the dark on a Breton hillside and told them to make it look like nothing had happened at all. That is what happened at the Battle of Morlaix.